Hello, I'm Richard Willett, and I'm going to read from my novel, A Friend of Dorothy's, which was my first and only novel. I'm mostly known as a playwright and a screenwriter. I wrote this novel when I was in my 20s. It is about a young gay man who moves from Canada to New York City in the 1980s, just as the AIDS epidemic is unfolding in New York. And for those of you who know me, you may think that this means that the novel is semi-autobiographical, and indeed, like perhaps every first novel ever written, it is. It was excerpted in the legendary gay literary magazine Christopher Street, and it was also excerpted in the Journal of the University of Alaska, which is called Permafrost, but the book was never published. So I am now raising money here on Indiegogo to self-publish the book myself in the early part of next year. The part I'm going to read takes place just as Eric, the main character, is about to decide to leave Vancouver and move to New York. He is getting over an obsessive affair with a tortured English Jew named Thomas Stroud, who at 18 to Eric's 17 was an older man. And because he's 18, Eric has had trouble getting into the gay bars in Vancouver, which at that time, I'm not sure if this is still true, but the drinking age in Vancouver was 19, legal drinking age was 19. But that night, this night that we're going to join Eric on, he finally gains entry, even though he's underage, to the bar he most wanted to go to, which is the Gandhi Dancer. And we'll join him there. Later that week, in a flash of boldness or loneliness or just plain horniness, he decided to try his luck again at the Gandhi Dancer, the bar he still had not succeeded in entering. The Gandhi was located on False Creek at the corner of Hamilton and Davie Streets, in a warehouse district dark and echoing as you wandered through it during club hours, the pulse of disco music faint in the distance, and then louder and louder as you trotted downhill on Helmken, past more and more parked cars and round a corner to the sizzling neon sign that bathed gay figures in blue light, grouped about the thrumming enclave or bursting through its giant slatted wooden doors to let a gasp escape into the night. Of Donna Summer, of 10,000 beer bottles, of a couple hundred gay men trying to meet each other. The Gandhi Dancer was for men only, the hottest gay club in town. Its name had once referred to itinerant railroad workers of the 1920s who roamed from job to job, slinging tools forged by the Gandhi Manufacturing Company of Chicago. But the name had come to mean only one thing to Eric: sex, the free expression of adult love, the thing all the songs and all the clothes, the movies, the ideas of the time revolved around, the thing he craved instinctively, demanded, even though he could never seem to do it right. Ironically, despite the supposed heat of the place, more seasoned veterans of the scene referred to the Gandhi Dancer as an S&S bar, stand and stare. This mattered little to Eric, however, as he approached that moonlit night and discovered that the fates of admission were finally with him. Despite his intense nervousness as he turned that final corner onto Hamilton, he found himself throwing open one of those tall wooden-handled doors, paying his cover, and checking his coat with the casualness of a regular, no one but Eric batting an eye. He held his fist out to the burly bouncer and received the stamp of approval that floated him to the bar, which was right before him, a square in the center of everything. The tingle of the verboten colored his every step, but also the thrill of acceptance and the soon-to-be-forgotten pleasure of growing older. Beer in hand, he located himself against a wall across from one side of the bar, in shadow, not wanting to attract too much attention just yet, and proceeded to stand and stare. In front of him pulsed figures on the strobe-lit dance floor. Around the corner was a quieter alcove with tables. It was a weeknight and not too crowded, probably one of the reasons he knew that he had been let in, but it was also still early. He had not yet mastered the art of arriving at the clubs fashionably late. By law, the bars in Vancouver had to close at 1, but the fashionable hour to arrive kept getting later and later anyway, so that a lot of men seemed to spend all evening getting dressed or dawdling over dinner or a movie, only to dash to a club shortly after midnight, down a couple of quick drinks before last call, and then frantically try to connect with someone. As the Gandhi began to fill that evening, Eric noticed some extremely handsome men there, that a couple of them were looking his way. but he felt glued to the wall where he stood. It still seemed as if he could be thrown out of the magic kingdom at any moment, and he was afraid to move. And all this opportunity was dizzying. The sex act, as incomplete as it generally felt to him, remained tied in his mind to particular men, one at a time. And the secret of the Gandy dancer seemed to be that this was not the way, that the world was in fact full of men, and one was meant to unite with them all. Before he had time for one gulp of his second blue, he saw Murray coming in the front door. It flashed through his mind in an odd mixture of panic and pleasure that Thomas might saunter in after him. But instead, Roy followed, beaming artificially as usual. As he walked toward Eric, Murray was passed by one of the handsome men on his way out, and he indicated his opinion of the man by turning toward his back, opening his mouth wide and pointing with a finger as if to say, "This end up." "Eric," he purred, "what a surprise," and headed for the bar. "We were just talking about you," Roy said enigmatically, and Murray slapped him on the arm. Some more guys from UBC showed up. Henry Wilson, the shaggy-haired botanist, began to talk to Eric about the giant flowers he was growing in the lab on campus. The DJ played San Francisco by the Village People the first time Eric heard it, the song that would become a kind of anthem that summer, performed by the prefab group that would forever be a symbol, however embarrassing, of the gay 70s. Henry got Eric off his perch by asking him to dance. They set their beers down and moved toward the floor, Eric discovering along the way that navigating a room like this could be an art in itself. But he had spoken with Henry at several club meetings. He was skinny and cute and warm, likable and smart. And years later, when Henry had found a lover and Eric visited Vancouver one summer when the boyfriend was out of town, Eric pushed his way into Henry's bed with the weight of a sadness that sex failed utterly to articulate. "You were there," the sadness said. "You were there, and I chose him." Henry went back to his friends from the club, who were around the corner from the dance floor in the nook where there were tables and tall wood shelves filled with books no one read. Eric, drunk at the bar, saw Murray's face multiply 3 times in front of him. "You know him," he heard himself say. "You've known him for some time. He's close to you. Come on, honey," he seemed to hear Murray say. "It's time to put you in a cab." "Don't you love him?" Eric said. "Don't you want him? How can you be near him? How can you be that lucky and not know it?" "Oh, Mary," someone said. "Yes," Murray replied. Then to Eric, "Look, honey, you just picked the wrong guy, okay? It happens to the best of us. He's not available to anybody right now. But he was once. Le professeur, you know? If I hadn't, I could have guessed. One day you'll realize that everybody has a story, Eric. The trick is to find the one you're in." He ordered Eric a coffee from the bar, and as he drank it, his mind began to clear a bit. "Best go home and sleep it off," Murray said. And soon Eric headed out to do just that, weaving a little on his way to the exit through which he had so amazingly entered just a couple of hours earlier, grabbing for his coat and trying to look nonchalant as he fell through the wooden doors into the darkness, leaving behind the handsome men, Murray, Roy, and Henry Wilson, who may have wondered at Eric's mood swings, aloof earlier, then so drunk and emotional with Murray. Or perhaps Henry hadn't seen him later, reeling into the night. Perhaps he only wondered at his odd coolness on the dance floor, his seeming self-sufficiency. Then again, perhaps as Eric headed tiltingly uphill back to the West End, Henry had hardly given him a thought, had only taken another sip of his first and last beer, and continued to search calmly for his future boyfriend, whom he would live with eventually, and whom he would meet one open-hearted night in an undiscovered corner of the Gandy Dancer. Eric discovered gay porn that summer. He'd known about it before, but he had never actually bought any of the slick magazines that danced out at him from all the newsstands in the West End. He confined his jerking off fantasies to the pink pages of The Advocate, the occasional After Dark, and his own imagination. He'd been preoccupied with the pursuit of romance with a live person, and as well had lacked the nerve to admit tacitly to some news vendor and anyone else who happened to be present that he was on his way home to whack off looking at pictures of naked men. But as Thomas Stroud receded and no one rose to take his place, that long, hot summer of 1977 ticked off on his Donna Summer 4 Seasons of Love calendar, belonged increasingly to the men of Blue Boy, Mandate, and In Touch. Eric remembered the details of their faces and bodies as if they had been lovers. The bars were more corporeal, if nothing else, although the experience was not unlike a more time-consuming issue of Blue Boy. Eric began to go to the clubs more and more as the year progressed, and for the first time to go home with men he met there. His 19th birthday, when he would finally be legal drinking age, was now within reach, but he was rarely asked for ID anymore. He began his second year of university lackadaisically. It was depressing for him to see Thomas Stroud as a casual friend, to revisit the haunts of their brief romance, if it could even be called that, mostly to grieve for what he had hoped would be. And toward the end of the year, near Christmas, he began to see Thomas in the bars and to see him go home with other men, which always took Eric straight to another blue, or two or three, and hopefully the arms of someone, anyone, someone else's home, someone else's life for a while. The burly horse breeder who drove him what seemed miles and miles outside the city to Richmond and sucked his cock in front of a table full of trophies. The black man who took him to breakfast at McDonald's and bitched about his wife the whole time, and who the night before had complained that all you young boys ever want to do is snuggle. What is this snuggle shit? The hippie who'd just gotten out of jail for a drug conviction and talked about death after Eric fucked him one torrid July midnight. It's just another trip, he said, lacing up his boots on the other side of Eric's apartment. That's the way I see it. Death is just another trip. He began to keep a list of his tricks, like notches in a belt, and to worry if too much time went by without adding a new one. The love affair had opened on Seymour Street, and Eric might go there to dance, but eventually, in the same evening, he'd end up alone over on Hamilton, striding drunkenly toward the traffic along False Creek, throwing back his head and all but baying at the moon over the Gandy dancer. He began to watch intently the men he saw Thomas Stroud leave with. They were all older, at least a few years past student age. They all had mustaches and were well built, certainly bigger than Eric. He would strip before the mirror in his mildewy bathroom at the Garth, and with the aid of a hand mirror, study cruelly, minutely his thin, scarred young body. He joined the YMCA just a block away from his apartment and started to work out, to swim, to jog, and miraculous changes occurred. He gained 5 pounds of muscle in 6 months. He fussed and bothered over the sparse beginnings of a mustache, but in the darkness of a disco, it looked fuller and aged him, the thing he wanted most of all. He dressed now to accentuate his body, small-sized t-shirts that fit more tightly than medium on his arms and chest, blue jeans that threatened to cut off circulation. And he raided the Army and Navy for a supply of plaid shirts and work boots. The change in his reception at the bars was almost unbelievable. Seemingly overnight, he went from being a potentially exploitable, sweet young thing to being something more threatening, eliciting overtures from a whole different class of men. And more of them. If he just pumped up at the gym, sometimes the numbers seemed to double. He was no more sexually adept than he'd ever been, but as man after man after man crossed his path, this seemed to matter less and less. The perception now was that he was sexy, and appearances were everything. He dropped out of school. He had never really understood the purpose of his studies anyway. But he dropped out to escape from memory, from hope, and to seek a degree, cum laude, from the Gandy dancer. And then even that wasn't enough. He needed to move on. He had to get out of Vancouver. He had to get out of Canada. Like someone plotting a cockeyed career, an insane resume, he thought, if I'm this successful night after night at the Gandy, I should move up. San Francisco, maybe, LA, New York. The sky was the limit.